Today, our speaker is Anne de Mare, and she will be speaking on documenting democracy. After our lunch, which today will be here in Ceremonial Hall, we will be showing the film that Anne made. So let me just say a little bit about her. She is director of the 2018 documentary film Capturing the Flag, which she will speak about this morning and which we will screen after lunch. Anne is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker whose feature film exploring the realities of youth homelessness, titled The Home Stretch, received the 2015 Emmy for Outstanding Business and Economic Reporting long form. Anne is a fierce believer in the power of story to affect change and worked on that film's extensive impact campaign for over 2 years, personally speaking at 58 events in 23 cities and engaging everyone from senior federal policy officials to local housing authorities to at-risk youth and high school students. So, she can talk. Please welcome Anne de Mare.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you, Ethical Culture, for asking me to come and talk about this film. Just to give you a little bit of background, and then I'm going to show you the trailer from the film to put things in context. This film stemmed out of a profound frustration that I had, as well as the other producers in the film had, with the dialogue before the 2016 presidential election. There was a lot to be unhappy about in the way that that presidential campaign went through time. But the thing that I found most frustrating was that there wasn't anyone really talking about what it felt like to be a citizen in that moment. And that I felt this real diminishment of the role of the citizen in our public discourse about democracy and about government. We were sort of focused on the highest levels of government and nothing else. And so when I learned about the work that Laverne Berry and Stephen Miller, who were featured in the film, did, they're lawyers who volunteer their time and their resources during presidential elections to go and do voter protection work at the polls. They're very much regular citizens, although they're kind of extraordinary regular citizens. I set out to make a short film about civic engagement and how do you participate in democracy. I wasn't expecting to make a film about voter suppression. I wasn't expecting to make a film about how to save our democracy or how to think about saving our democracy. But what happened on the ground in North Carolina and what happened in the country after that really made me rethink not only what I was doing as a filmmaker, but what I was doing as a citizen. So to give you just a little bit of background so that the talk will make a little sense, I want to show you a 3-minute trailer of the piece. I don't have any AV people, so I'm just going to try to do this myself. He's here. Is he here? Yeah. So if we can just play the first one. Let me turn the lights off, yeah. Oh yeah, if we can go all the way down, that would be great.
Every American citizen must have an equal right to vote. There is no moral issue.
In the United States of America, one man, one vote. That's our definition of democracy. And then we don't give the one man the vote. Big fat lie.
What happens in North Carolina is going to be very important for what happens in the whole country. This is the test ground for voter rights.
The NAACP claims a state board of elections and 3 county boards are removing thousands of people from voter rolls illegally.
People volunteer in a lot of ways. I work for everyone to be able to vote.
Well, I've been clicking back and forth, website to website, trying to figure out where everything was just I feel a little bit like I'm standing on the middle. People on the ground already reporting the suppression of the vote.
Our legislature decided to pass some voter restriction that significantly altered voting in North Carolina.
We knew it was being challenged, so how do we even prepare for election day not knowing what laws are going to be in effect?
I wish I knew this laws as well as I know my everyday working and quick because I don't think one chance to get it right.
I'm hoping that we will merely be observing people carrying out their democratic rights in a peaceful way.
I am a lawyer and I've been assigned to answer questions.
The woman was just telling us she got in right at the beginning and they kept her in there for 45 minutes. There was a complete mass.
Excuse me, ma'am, did everything go okay? Were you able to go?
Over here, now I've got to go over there.
Me and two of the black guys are the only guys that the DOD forgot to process.
They sent me here. Now these people here tell me I cannot go here. It's not here. This is not fair.
Nobody would fight this hard to take something from us that wasn't powerful.
When you deny a person the right to vote, then you take away every other constitutional right that they might have.
People are aware that there's a problem. I don't believe people are aware of the extent of the problem.
The history of our country is a history of struggle for the right to have a voice.
Each one of us has some valuable asset that we can use to fight these fights that need to be fought now. We better use what's in our hands. The heart and soul of America is at stake.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'll say that I didn't notice.
Can you start? Yeah. And I don't think we're going to play those other clips this morning because we only have a little bit of time. So that's the trailer for the film. And what I just want to talk a little bit about my experience and what I learned, because a lot of what documentary film is bearing witness. There are people who make films where they sort of have a thesis that they want to prove, and they go out and they prove that thesis, and there's some wonderful films that do that. But I tend to work in what they call cinema verite film, where I just try to go and explore the reality of what happens on the ground without a narration and without a point of view, a strong point of view, I should say. What I really learned on the ground was that voter suppression now looks incredibly different than it looked in the civil rights movement, which is, I think, the memory of voter suppression that we all have, where there's a real obvious blockage of the vote. There's a sense that people are being prevented in a very overt way. While we have some of that now, and I mean, there's stuff in the news right now about Georgia and North Dakota are sort of at the top of that list. The thing that's really scary to me about where we are right now is that voter suppression is really insidious. It's really hard to put your finger on, and it's really hard to identify. And a lot of the people who are experiencing their rights being taken away, because what's happening is a kind of 1,000 little cuts of misinformation, misdirection, laws that disenfranchise based on voter ID, based on changing districts. What you have is when people find that they're turned away at the poll, they very often think that it's their own fault, and so they take it inward. And that sort of shifting of the blame from the system to the individual who cannot express their voice is, I think, one of the biggest issues we face now. For me as a citizen, the thing that really shifted making this film was that I started to understand that democracy itself is the process through which we bear witness to each other. And that's something that I don't think we're really talking about. That, democracy is this amazing tool for civilization. And it gives us a lot of framework under which we can govern ourselves. But what we do when we vote is not only say what we believe is the best thing for the world and for our society, but we have to listen to what other people think is the best thing for our society. And we have to really listen to their experiences and their lives. And when we have these laws and these structures in place that systematically disenfranchise people, particularly the poor and minorities, what we're really saying is that we don't want to look at your experience. We don't want to take that into ourselves and move forward as a society with it. And that's why it's so dangerous, because it's preventing us from making the right decisions for all of us when we don't listen to every voice. And that's sort of been the shift for me. I grew up in New York City. I was very well educated. I understood civics. I understood my kind of responsibility as a citizen to vote. But I never really thought about the fact that what I really had to do was listen. And I think that democracy is ultimately a conversation. It's a conversation that we have with each other about our own government. And we have been, I believe, my feeling is that everyday citizens have been pushed aside in that conversation, and we need to reassert our voices. So a lot of what's been happening with the film that we're going to show this afternoon is that I've spent the last 6 weeks sort of traveling the country in different places with it and talking to really different audiences. We went to 16 colleges and universities with the film and engaged with both student groups and grassroots organizations. And then we've done a number of events like this and also film festivals. And it's really interesting to go to places where the political feeling is really different than New York. And I think that the thing that has been sort of interesting to think about, and what I bring to you, because I think in this room there's a pretty much an assurance that we all sort of have a similar leaning politically. I could tell from Dan's introduction. But what's interesting is that there's two things that happen when the conversation, the political conversation, gets so polarized. One is that we've moved further left and further right in the way we talk about things. But the other thing that happens is we move further apart in terms of people who are willing and able to participate and activate and be engaged, and people who really are just shut down. And a lot of the most difficult conversations that I've had in the last 6 weeks have been, I think the most difficult one was at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky. And we did a screening that was organized by the local radio station and the local students, student groups. And we had a really small turnout. They'd done a lot of publicity for the film, but we had a really small turnout. And the conversation after we talked about, what we see in the film and the different means under which people's votes are suppressed, we talked about how challenging it was for those students in the room to engage their peers in politics. And we talked about how much there's just this feeling that you as an individual can't make a difference, this feeling that it's really ugly, that you want to step away from it, that you don't want to participate. And I think that that's the biggest danger that comes from this sense of the diminishment of the vote and the diminishment of the role of citizenship, is that it pulls people out of the system, and it makes people shut down. And I feel like our challenge, as much as it is to get out the vote, it's also to remind people that you don't have to do something big. You don't have to fix everything. If you do a little thing, it is a help. And that's what we have to do, is help each other through the process. I learned a tremendous amount from Steve and Laverne, who were the main two characters in the film, because their certainty that the simple act of standing outside the polls and asking every single person, did you have an issue? How was the experience? What happened to you? And if they had a problem, just being present with them through that experience and trying to get them help, it was an enormous thing to see how much people cared about voting and how much they just needed someone to be there and witness their experience with them to get them through to the next place. So I feel like, the only thing I can really offer the room is my own, what I saw on the ground. And I hope a lot of you can stay and see the film this afternoon. But also this fact that if you make some phone calls, if you drive your neighbor to the poll, if you talk to your children, if you talk to your parents, that's what we need to do, and we need to not feel like that's too small. I mean, people do what they have a capability to do, and there are people who can do huge things. What I could do was make this film and bring it around. But there's a great line in the film. Reverend William Barber, who's in the film over in a couple of different places, talks about looking at what's in your hand and using what's in your hand to help the situation. And I think that that's the great lesson of democracy, is that we all have something in our hand that we can bring to the equation. And so I think that for me, what I'd like to communicate and what I hope the film communicates is that if we can have faith in each other and listen to each other, and that means listening to people we don't want to listen to a lot of the time, we can move forward as one. If we can't listen to each other, we can't move forward in the democracy. And so that's why it's so important that the voices that are disenfranchised are included. But it's also important that we listen to the voices that are in opposition to us and have a conversation with them rather than push them completely aside. And that's really hard to do. My own mother is an avid Trump supporter. And it's really hard. She's 84 years old. She's a sweet little old lady from Oklahoma. And we have a real problem having conversations. And I look at the fact that the last years of her life are engaged in this real dilemma where we have a fundamental difference about politics. But what's interesting is I find that if we can stop talking about politics and start talking about people's experiences, we can actually get somewhere. And I'll just share a little personal anecdote, which is she's seen the film. And I went out to visit her and I put it on her computer for her to watch. And I didn't stay to watch it with her, and I came back to New York. She lives out west. And I didn't hear from her for a really long time. I thought, I don't know, did she watch it? Did she hate it? I know she's going to disagree with the politics of all the people in it. But she wrote me this amazing email that started off by saying, I'm still enough of a Southerner that I don't like the idea of a bunch of Northerners going down south and telling people what to do and how to do it. So that was what she entered the film with. But she went on to write that while she disagreed with the politics of the people in the film, the essential message that everybody needs to vote is so important and we need to listen to it. And I think that that's the gift that I hope the film can give. And I've seen it, even though there are some very powerful, raw moments in it where people's personal politics and their opinions come out. When we screen the film to mixed audiences, mixed meaning left and right now, what we've found is that this idea of who gets to vote and who doesn't get to vote, there's a fundamental divide. There are people who think that voting is a right, and there are people who think voting is a privilege. And I think we have to start to talk about that difference, because if something is a right, then everybody has the right to it. If something is a privilege, you have to earn it. And when you put laws in place that make people earn that right, you create a very different environment for people who are traditionally at the bottom of society than if it's a right that everybody has. So I think that that's sort of where the conversation is. I'd love to talk a little and hear from you guys if there are questions about what we look at now as voter suppression. There are many different things that go into it, from voter ID laws to voter purges to systemic failures in administration that happen, to gerrymandering, to changing districts and bad communication about election laws. One of the biggest problems we faced in North Carolina was that the election laws were constantly changing. As we were driving down, we were experiencing court rulings coming in that were affecting how things were actually going to play out at the polls. And so it kept the sort of situation at the polls moving for people. And that sort of uncertainty is really hard to handle, because if I went down with a group of lawyers and if they couldn't understand what the laws were, how did the regular citizens fare in that? And also, how did the election officials, which tend to be everyday citizens running the polls, how did they figure out what was going on? And what you found was the interpretation of those changing laws was really different from polling place to polling place. So anyway, I'd love to open it up, because I know that everyone feels really powerfully about these issues, and I think Dan's going to help me with question and answer, just to hear if you have questions about it, about the concept of voter suppression in the modern age. Maybe you don't, because you're all very well informed. David. think someone just won the marathon, by the way.
I have a question about the film addresses how water suppression affects felons. And I think in my perspective, coming from a different country,
Yeah.
different bodies are right.
Yeah.
So when you mentioned about how whether voting is a right or it's a privilege, and I'm wondering how some politicians and lawmakers can have created a systemic use of suppressing people to vote because they are felons, and we know the law that affect felons and minorities.
Right.
They may target specific subgroups. So I'm wondering if the film touches about that and what we could do to change that.
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. The film itself doesn't directly address felony disenfranchisement because we didn't encounter anyone on the ground in North Carolina that was having that issue at the polls. In North Carolina, you cannot vote if you're a convicted felon. It varies state to state. Here's one of the essential problems, I think, about how we can approach fixing the issue of voting rights in the country, which is that there's no right to vote guaranteed by the Constitution. The Constitution grants the states the right to determine how voting happens within their own state. So when you talk about fixing things, you're not talking about fixing one thing, you're talking about fixing 50 things. And there's a lot of problems with that. One is it's 50 things to fix, and the other is that what it means is that the control of the election law goes down to the state houses. And as we know, the state houses have some really radical governments right now. The North Carolina State House, I think, is the most radical state house in the country. They literally passed laws after the 2016 election to take the power away from the governor when the governor was elected in the opposite party. So, you have these kind of shenanigans that go on. Felony disenfranchisement is huge, and I think a lot of eyes are on what happens in Florida with the ballot initiatives there, because there's a ballot initiative that would essentially give felons back the right to vote. The felony question touches on so many different levels of what the problem with voter suppression is. It touches on the race card, the poverty card, the criminal justice card. And it also is essential to exactly what you drew the dots directly, is whether this is a right or a privilege, and if you can lose that right and how you lose that right to vote. So I wish the film did deal with it more directly, but we didn't encounter anyone with it. The film also doesn't deal directly with gerrymandering. It deals with confusion over changing districts, but it doesn't deal with that fundamental thing of I'm voting in a minority-majority district, so therefore my vote is diminished. So, yeah.
No. For what you're doing. Thanks for what you're doing. And I love the work with what you got idea.
Yeah.
I really feel for the people who try to vote and are told they can't for whatever reason.
Yeah.
And how you simply feel like it's their fault.
Yeah.
I get that.
Yeah.
You may never vote again. So
Yeah.
I just wondered, how much that, have you talked to people about that?
Yeah, there's actually a moment in the film that after Election Day, because the film takes us, after Election Day into the what do we do now, where the subjects are speaking at a political conference, and they bring up that question: if you make it really difficult for someone to vote today, do you think they're going to show up in 4 years or 2 years or 6 years and vote again? And I think that's that thing about the diminishment of your vote. I mean, I grew up in New York, and I'm a fairly well-educated person, and I was still told my whole life that my vote didn't matter because I lived in New York, and New York's going to go blue, and so why are you going to bother? And that's a really dangerous thought process. It's dangerous for a lot of reasons. Number one, it's not just the president that matters. You have to vote the whole ticket, and local elections actually have a bigger impact on people's day-to-day lives. But the other thing is, if we're ever going to be able to really eliminate the historic relic that is the Electoral College in this country, we need to understand what the popular vote actually is. And we don't understand that because people who are in blue states don't turn out. I mean, we had horrible, horrible turnout rate in New York State. I think it was 40%. Yeah, 40% voted. And if you think about that, it's really shameful because we have a lot of population. And that number of the people, if we got everyone to vote, we would really see what we're talking about. And we know that the red states tend to be less populated states than the blue states. And we know that it's rigged. I mean, there's the great line, which is that, the Electoral College is kind of the biggest gerrymander that there is, right? So that's one of the reasons why we really have to turn up and vote. I want to say that I showed the film in Minneapolis a few weeks ago at the Walker Art Center Cinema, which is a beautiful, beautiful theater. And they did a really great program for us when we screened, and they brought the head of voter outreach for the state of Minnesota to be on the panel with me, and Laverne also came. And Minnesota is #1 in voter turnout. And the Nasser Musa, who was the head of outreach, had a lot of things to say about that. And there were some things he said that just were shocking to me. And I was like, well, this is really makes a lot of sense, which is that you can register to vote if you're homeless in Minnesota. There is a procedure by which you can tell them what your situation is, where you usually are, and they will figure out where you should vote, and you will be able to vote. I mean, and that's one of the reasons why their turnout is so high, is that they make it really easy. And they actually reach out into communities, particularly communities that are traditionally disenfranchised, and they help them through the process. I think that it's really hard for some people to know. The film I made before this one was the film about homeless youth. And I always use them when I hear the argument, well, everybody has an ID, right? What is this voter ID thing? You need an ID everywhere. And it's interesting because I personally knew a tremendous number of young adults between the ages of 18 and 30 who had no identification because they had been failed by the foster care system, they had been abandoned as children, they'd been kicked out of the house because of their sexual orientation. For whatever reason, they had no paperwork for themselves. And when we premiered the film, we premiered it in Toronto at a festival called Hot Docs, and we had to work with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless to get them identification so that they could get passports so that they could come. And so you have to understand like the levels, you have to, and that's that thing about bearing witness. We have to really be witness to the experience of our fellow citizens, and we have to take that into account. And I think that the more we narrow, you end up with the rhetoric of hate that we have right now, and this sense that people shouldn't be allowed to vote. And that's just such a dangerous thought. I just want you to think about that. I mean, it's such a dangerous thought that people believe that there are people who should not be able to vote. Because what you're saying is there are people who should not have autonomy over themselves. And that's the most undemocratic thing I can think of. Yeah, so there's a couple questions over there.
So, the language we use conveys the meaning.
Yes.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
So when we talk about the two alternatives, which is what's a right and
Yeah.
what's a privilege, there's a lot behind each of those terms.
Oh, yeah.
If it's a right, everybody's entitled to it.
Yes.
If it's a privilege, you have to earn it.
Yes.
And there are countries in which voting is an obligation and a responsibility.
Yeah.
It is part of the cost of
Yeah.
being a good citizen.
Yes.
And benefiting from whatever the government offers.
Yeah.
So we don't really use that word here. We do when it comes to jury duty.
Yeah.
Everyone is obligated to pay taxes and to serve on a jury.
Right.
Why are we not obligated? You know, the system of justice doesn't function properly if we don't have all the voices on the jury and we can't get a jury of our peers.
Yeah.
Why does that not apply to voting?
Well, I mean, there's a long legacy to that. It's a really good question, but there's a long legacy, and I think it stems in the way that the country was founded and the people who initially had the right to vote. I think we forget that it's been this constant struggle. We've never gotten there. Like, people talk about how we're, it's so horrible now, how can we face this? It's like, let's be real. Like, up until the 1970s, it was really, really difficult for African Americans in this country to vote in a huge percentage of the states in this country. So we have never hit that ideal. But I think that that's the reason why, is that the control of the vote is as American as anything else. And this idea that America is this bastion of democracy, it is, but only because it kept striving for it. I think the thing that's so scary now, when you think about the fact that we sort of turned this corner and we're headed in the opposite direction, is that we don't seem to be striving for that goal anymore. We don't seem to be looking at our demons and trying to get past them. We seem to be looking at certain things that I consider demons and embracing them from the highest office in the land. The other thing that's so difficult to think about now, and I think why it'll be really interesting to see the fallout from this election, not only are there new voting restrictions in 26 states since 2010. I mean, this is, half the states in the country have new restrictions since the 2010 midterms. But we also, for the very first time, are looking at an election where the federal administration is not friendly to voting rights. And that changes the conversation. And it changes the way we can have the conversation. And I think that that's what makes this election so important, is that it's a referendum on Trump's first 2 years in the presidency, and we all know how we feel about that, but it also is a referendum on who has access to the ballot. And I'm excited by the early numbers that are coming in from early voting in a lot of the states, but I'm also terrified, because no matter how this election goes, this fight is going to get really ugly between now and 2020, and I think we all have to be prepared for that. These issues are not going to go away. Even if we had the biggest blue wave you can imagine, we're still going to be facing state houses, secretaries of states, and attorney generals who are completely hostile to the idea that everybody should be able to vote. That's a problem.
John? And Jesus.
What part did language issues play in access to voting? I mean, here in New York, of course, we have interpreters at all of the polling places.
Yeah.
The election materials are translated into several languages and so on, which still does not help those people who don't happen to speak one of the languages that are represented. How did that play out in
North Carolina, we didn't have a huge number of issues with it because most of the people who were voting in the precincts that we were in were English speakers, but there were enormous problems in other states, particularly in Arizona. Arizona is one of the real battlegrounds for these issues because there is so much immigration in Arizona, and it also is a border state. But I think that the language issue is huge, and you encounter this. You encounter a lot of real hostility to the idea of non-English speakers around the election day itself. It sort of reinvigorates people who are angry about the fact that not everyone speaks the same language. Interestingly enough, I mean, there is no official language in America, which I think a lot of people don't realize. But yeah, in New York. Yeah.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, if you could give us if you could briefly educate us on the arguments for each of these two positions about privilege and right.
Yeah.
And the other one is from the perspective of the federal government. What is the role, the official role, if any, in ensuring voting participation?
Right. So for me, the idea, I think Monica said it really well, the idea of right and privilege has to do with what whether it's something that you have innate in yourself or whether it's something that you have to earn. Two of the tools I think that are the most, well, there's three, but two of the tools that are really powerful in terms of voter suppression are the need for voter ID. And I think, again, we have these conversations at the top level where we're screaming at each other, which is everybody needs to have ID, nobody needs to have ID. And we stay up here and we don't look at the actual issue, which is that we have citizens in this country that have no identification. And how do we approach that? And also when we talk about voter ID, the North Carolina voting law that was passed in 2013, which was called the Monster Suppression Bill, went out, it was publicized as a voter ID law. It was 57 pages long. Okay, this was not a voter ID law. This was 57 pages of different restrictions that eliminated things like early voting and same-day registration, and also imposed an incredibly strict voter ID. There are states where it says instead of it being a government ID, it has to be certain kinds of government ID. In Alabama, I believe, your state housing ID, which has your photograph on it, doesn't qualify. So if you're in public housing, that identification won't work, but your gun license will. So it is about what forms of identification we're talking about. And so voter ID is a huge piece of that idea of privilege, right? So you have to have certain paperwork in order to vote. There's also a documentary proof of citizenship laws on the books in a lot of states. Particularly Kansas pushed this one out really hard, which means that to register to vote, you have to show up with either a passport or a notarized birth certificate. The problem with that is since 9/11, a lot of states won't mail you your birth certificate anymore. So if you don't actually possess one, the only way to get one is to go to the courthouse in your home state to get it, which of course disenfranchises people who don't have the funds to go back and to obtain that. So they may have a driver's license, but because they don't have that notarized birth certificate, they can't register to vote. So it's not as simple as ID, no ID. You have to really parse that out. And I think our conversations need to become more nuanced about it so that we're not just yelling at each other in these fights that become empirical. You either believe in it 100% or 0%. The other thing that happens in terms of voter suppression that's really powerful are these voter purges. Everyone's heard this, particularly, in Ohio and Georgia. And here in Brooklyn, we had a pretty big one. So it's in most state charters that they have to clean up the voter rolls, that they have to take off people who've passed away, people who've moved. It's not about the act of removing people from the rolls. It's about the data that's used to do that. And time again, especially in these large-scale purges, we see that flawed data is used that that disenfranchises poor and minority at a much greater rate. So when you hear the word voter purges, not all purges are bad, but purges being used with selective data by state houses that have a real desire to see certain people removed from those rolls, it's really problematic. On the ground in North Carolina, one of the things that changed right before Election Day was that there had been a purge in the county that we were working in, where they found that 3,000 people had been purged illegally. And the way that had happened is that North Carolina has this thing called an individual challenge law, where any citizen can challenge any other citizen's right to vote. Think about that for a minute. So and it was basically spearheaded by one individual, but what people were doing was searching out people who got their mail delivered to post office boxes. This sounds familiar to North Dakota, right? They were searching out people who got their mail in post office boxes, mailing a postcard to their street address. When it came back as undeliverable, they went to the Board of Elections and they said, they don't live here anymore, take them off the rolls. And the Board of Elections cooperated with that, even though they understood what was going on. And so that's the kind of thing that can happen if we're not vigilant about watching what's going on. And so on the surface, voter ID may sound like a reasonable thing, or voter purges may seem like, well, we have to take all those dead people off because we know they're going to vote, But at the same point in time, how they can be perverted by a system that gives the power to the party in power is really terrifying. And I have to say, with certain parts of voter suppression, like gerrymandering, the Democratic Party is just as guilty as the Republicans. We need to take the actual process of democracy out of this partisan power play. There are certain democratic institutions that are important enough to protect, even if they give voice to people we disagree with. And I think that's the essential thing that I walked away with, is like, I am interested in supporting democracy. Because if we can't fix voting, this issue, we can't fix anything else. Without this, we don't have the power to fix the other things. And so when I started this, it was not my big issue. I mean, I believed in voting, I believed in democracy, but it wasn't up there for me. Now I really do believe it's the biggest issue we face. And we also have an administration that has been systemically discrediting the democratic norms. From the fourth state with the press to the judiciary, we are now in partisan politics everywhere. There's no structure of democracy that's held above that right now, and that's a really dangerous place to be. So that's it. I'm sorry I went on and on.